Hi, I'm Cassandra. Last winter, my own brother locked me out of our family home, told me I was a financial burden, and called me damaged goods because of my military service. They left my belongings in trash bags on the porch while it was snowing. But what they didn't know was that I had already built a $3.2 million investment portfolio while they were drowning in debt. And when I walked into their bankruptcy hearing with my financial records, the entire courtroom fell silent. Stick around, because sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who could have saved you all along. Before we continue, what time are you watching and where from? Drop a comment below. Let's see how far this story travels. I parked 3 blocks away from the county courthouse, even though there was plenty of parking in the municipal lot. But ever since that night when my brother Marcus told me I needed to stop being a charity case and figure out how to support myself like an adult, I'd gotten used to taking the long way around. It was late March in Westridge, still cold enough to see your breath, but just warm enough that the snow had turned to slush. The kind of weather that makes your joints ache if you've spent too many nights sleeping in military tents. My service boots splashed through puddles as I made my way toward the courthouse steps. 5 years back from Afghanistan, and I still wore them most days, broken in perfectly, reliable. Unlike family. The county courthouse was an imposing brick structure, all marble columns and high ceilings that made every footstep echo. Inside, the air smelled of furniture polish and desperation. People clutched manila folders filled with financial statements, avoiding eye contact, shoulders hunched against the weight of insolvency. I recognized the posture. It was the same one I'd had after my first tour, before I figured out how to stand tall again. I checked the docket posted outside courtroom C. Parker Family Financial Hearing, 11:00 a.m. My family name in black and white, scheduled for financial autopsy. I smoothed down my simple navy blazer, nothing fancy, bought off the rack at a department store. The blazer that my sister-in-law Vanessa had once called the kind of thing you wear when you can't afford better. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same blazer I'd worn when signing the paperwork on my 4th investment property. I slipped into the courtroom at 10:45 and took a seat in the back row. Marcus and Vanessa hadn't arrived yet, but their bankruptcy attorney was already arranging documents on the table, his forehead creased with worry lines. He had good reason to look concerned. The Parker family finances were a crater, and he knew it. I pulled out my phone to check my investment app one more time. The numbers still seemed unreal sometimes. $3.2 million spread across diverse investments, real estate holdings, index funds, a venture capital stake in a veteran-run tech startup, and a healthy portion in government bonds. The kind of portfolio financial advisors nod approvingly at, the kind my family never believed I could build. At precisely 10:52, the doors opened, and Marcus walked in with Vanessa clinging to his arm like she might blow away without his support. My brother still looked the part of success, tailored suit that strained slightly at the buttons, expensive watch, haircut by someone who charged too much. But his eyes told a different story. Dark circles, bloodshot whites, the desperate darting, gaze of a man watching everything collapse. Vanessa spotted me first. Her perfectly lined lips parted in surprise, then pressed into a thin, disapproving line. She nudged Marcus, who turned and saw me. For a moment, something like shame flickered across his face. Then it hardened into the same dismissive expression. I'd seen the night he'd changed the locks. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, approaching my row. "This is a private family matter." I looked up at him calmly. "I am family, Marcus. Not for this. This isn't some military charity event where you can play the wounded veteran card. This is serious." The word stung, but I'd developed calluses against his barbs years ago. "I'm aware of how serious bankruptcy is. Then you should also be aware that you can't help, unless the Army suddenly started paying you in something other than disability checks." I said nothing, just held his gaze until he looked away first. Vanessa tugged his sleeve, and they moved to the front of the courtroom where their attorney waited, already looking exhausted by whatever conversation they'd had before arriving. The memory of that night 3 months ago surfaced unbidden. Snow falling heavily, myself standing on their porch after my brother had invited me for what I thought was dinner. Instead, I'd found my belongings in garbage bags, the locks changed, and Marcus telling me they couldn't support my lifestyle anymore. "It's not personal, Cass," he'd said, though it was exactly that. "We're going through some financial adjustments, and having you stay with us while you figure things out isn't working anymore." I hadn't been staying with them. I'd been visiting. For the weekend, I'd brought groceries as a thank you. "I have my own place," I'd said, confused. "Right. That studio apartment paid for by... what exactly? Your military benefits? Some government handout?" Meanwhile, we're drowning in real adult responsibilities. He hadn't known about my investment portfolio. None of them did. After my second tour, I'd started studying finance obsessively. Something about nearly dying in a desert made me fixate on security. I'd saved every penny of my combat pay, lived minimally, and invested strategically when I returned stateside. While Marcus and Vanessa bought luxury cars and renovated their kitchen for the third time, I was buying modest rental properties and watching compound interest work its magic. I lived simply not because I had to, but because excess had lost its appeal after seeing real scarcity. The courtroom doors opened again. My parents walked in, my father helping my mother with her coat. They looked older than they had at Christmas, just 3 months ago. Financial. Stress etches itself into faces quickly. My father's eyes met mine, and he nodded slightly, the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd received from him since I'd told him I was deploying the first time. He'd called it running away from real responsibility. My mother pretended not to see me. They joined Marcus and Vanessa at the front. The family unit, closed and complete without me. It had been that way since I'd enlisted at 18. Military service wasn't part of the Parker plan. I was supposed to join the family real estate business, sell overpriced homes to overextended buyers, and perpetuate the cycle of debt disguised as success that had finally caught up with them. Instead, I'd put on a uniform, learned how systems fail and how to survive when they do, and built something sustainable while they constructed a facade. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Eleanor Merritt, according to the nameplate, mid-60s, silver hair cut in a practical bob, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The kind of woman who didn't suffer fools gladly. She reviewed the documents before her with a slight frown, then looked up at my family. "Parker bankruptcy proceeding. I see we have the debtors present along with counsel. Are there any creditors or interested parties in attendance who wish to be recognized?" This was it. The moment I'd rehearsed during the 3-block walk from my car. I stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. Cassandra Parker. I'm a potential creditor and family member." The judge nodded, unfazed. "Very well, Ms. Parker. We'll hear from established creditors first, then address any additional claims." Marcus turned in his chair, his face flushing red. He mouthed, "What are you doing?" With such intensity I could practically hear it across the room. I took my seat again as the proceedings began. The family bankruptcy attorney presented their case: substantial debt across multiple properties, a failed expansion of the family business, underwater mortgages, credit lines maxed out. The familiar story of American excess, laid bare in spreadsheets and apologetic terminology. "The Parkers are requesting Chapter 7 protection with the following exempt assets," the attorney continued, listing the bare minimum they hope to keep. 1. Vehicle, their primary residence, though deeply mortgaged, personal effects. As he spoke, I opened my leather portfolio quietly. Inside were bank statements, investment records, property deeds, and a cashier's check. The evidence of everything I'd built while they thought I was failing. My father kept looking back at me, his expression a mix of confusion and growing concern. He'd always been able to read me better than the others, even through our estrangement. He could sense I wasn't here out of spite or curiosity. I was here with purpose. The judge was reviewing their asset declarations when there was a commotion at the courtroom door. My youngest brother, Riley, slipped in. The family golden boy, just 25 and already working at a prestigious law firm. He wasn't part of the bankruptcy. He'd wisely kept his finances separate, but he was here for moral support. He spotted me immediately and, unlike the others, came straight to where I sat. "Cass," he whispered, sliding in beside me. "What are you doing here?" Unlike Marcus's hostile question, Riley's held genuine curiosity. "Watching our family legacy crumble," I said quietly, and deciding whether to catch it. He studied my face, then noticed the portfolio in my lap. "You can help?" I met his eyes. Riley had been just 13 when I first deployed, too young to fully absorb the family's disapproval of my choices. The only one who still sent me birthday cards. "I can," I said. "The question is whether I should." Riley's eyes widened as he glanced from my portfolio to the proceedings at the front of the courtroom. Unlike the rest of my family, he'd always possessed a quiet perceptiveness that reminded me of myself before Afghanistan, before I learned. That perception without action was just another form of surrender. "How bad is it?" he whispered, nodding toward our family. "Worse than they're admitting," I murmured back. "The business has been underwater for at least 3 years. The truth was, I'd been monitoring the family real estate business remotely, ever since Marcus took over from our father. Not out of nosiness, but because I'd learned in the military that information was its own form of armor. Public records, property transfers, tax assessments, they told stories that family dinners never would. At the front of the courtroom, the bankruptcy trustee was now questioning my father about a series of cash withdrawals made in the months leading up to their filing. Large amounts, poorly documented. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his once commanding posture now hunched with defeat. "These withdrawals total nearly $78,000, Mr. Parker," the trustee said, her voice neutral but pointed. "Can you account for where those funds went?" My father cleared his throat. "Home repairs and business expenses, things we paid cash for." Even from the back row, I could spot the lie. My father had a tell, the way he ran his thumb along his wedding band when he wasn't being honest. A gesture I'd noticed as a child when he'd tell clients their dream home was just slightly above budget when he knew it was wildly unaffordable. The trustee wasn't convinced either. "Do you have receipts for these expenses?" "Some of them," my father hedged. "Our accountant should have records for the rest." The same accountant who was conspicuously absent from these proceedings. The family's financial wizard who had been creative with the books for as long as I could remember. I'd warned them about him before my second deployment. They'd dismissed my concerns as jealousy because I'd never been trusted with the family finances. Judge Merritt peered over her reading glasses. "Mr. Parker, the court will require documentation for all withdrawals. Without receipts, these funds will be considered undisclosed assets." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, a performance she'd perfected over decades of getting her way. I'd seen it at my high school graduation when she'd told relatives how heartbroken she was about my military enlistment. I'd seen it again when I'd come home with a Purple Heart, and she'd called it my participation trophy within earshot of my unit friends. The judge called for a 15-minute recess before creditors would present their claims. As everyone stood, Riley turned to me. "You never answered my text last Christmas," he said, sounding more hurt than accusatory. I sighed. It was a complicated time. "You mean after Marcus kicked you out?" When I looked surprised, he continued. "Vanessa told me you'd left suddenly after some kind of argument. I knew that didn't sound like you." Of course they'd rewritten the narrative. In the Parker family, image wasn't just everything. It was the only thing. They left my things in garbage bags on the porch, I said quietly. In the snow. While I was out picking up dessert for dinner. Riley's face flushed with anger. Jesus, Cass. Why didn't you tell me? What would you have done? Gone against the family for the black sheep veteran sister? He looked away, acknowledging the truth of it. The Parkers closed ranks, always. It was how we'd been raised. Across the courtroom, Marcus had noticed Riley sitting with me. His face darkened as he marched toward us, Vanessa trailing behind in her designer heels that clicked an anxious rhythm on the marble floor. Riley, what are you doing? Marcus hissed. We need to discuss strategy with the attorney. Riley didn't budge. I'm talking to our sister. She shouldn't even be here. Vanessa cut in, not looking at me directly. This is a private family matter. I smiled thinly. Funny how I'm family when you need military discounts for your car, Vanessa. But not when it actually matters. Her cheeks flushed. Last year, she'd called asking for my service verification to get 15% off her new BMW. The same woman who'd told my mother I was using my service as a crutch when I needed surgery for my knee injury. What are you even doing here, Cassandra? Marcus demanded. Come to gloat? See the mighty Parkers fall? I met his gaze steadily. I'm here because, unlike you, I don't abandon family when things get difficult. That's rich coming from someone who left for years at a time, he scoffed. I was serving my country, not running away, I replied, my voice level but firm. And I never locked any of you out in the snow. Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable for a split second before his defensiveness resurged. We were under financial pressure? Having another mouth to feed? I brought groceries that night, I interrupted. And I've never once asked any of you for money. Your disability checks can't possibly cover. I cut him off again. You have no idea what I have or haven't built while I was gone, Marcus. That's the problem. The bankruptcy attorney approached, clearly sensing the tension. Mr. Parker, we need to prepare for the creditor's statements. This isn't helping our position. Marcus straightened his tie, composing himself. We'll continue this discussion later, he said to me, though it sounded more like a threat than a promise. As they walked away, Riley stayed beside me. What did you mean about deciding whether to catch the family legacy? He asked. I opened my portfolio slightly, just enough for him to glimpse the top document, a bank statement with a balance that made his eyes widen. Cass, how did you— Very carefully, I said, closing the folder. And with none of the flash, and minimal risk. The courtroom doors opened, and people began filing back in for the continuation of the hearing. Riley squeezed my arm before returning to sit with our parents. I remained in the back, watching as various creditors approached the podium, the bank holding the mortgage on the family home, credit card companies, a private lender who'd financed the business expansion. The numbers were staggering. All told, my family had accumulated nearly $4.2 million in debt, with assets that, even generously appraised, wouldn't cover half that amount. Years of living beyond their means, leveraging one property to finance another, and padding their lifestyle with credit had finally caught up with them. As the final creditor concluded, Judge Merritt looked toward the back of the courtroom. Ms. Parker, you indicated you may have a claim against the estate. Please approach. My heart pounded as I stood, clutching my portfolio. This wasn't about revenge. It had never been about that. This was about truth and consequences, about values that my family had forgotten, but that had been hammered into me in the harshest of environments. I walked slowly to the podium, aware of every eye in the courtroom tracking my movement. My father looked confused, my mother worried. Marcus was glaring, while Riley watched with something like hope. Your Honor, I began, my voice stronger than I expected. 5 years ago, I provided a loan of $180,000 to Parker Family Properties for the purchase of the Lakeside development parcel. I slid the promissory note from my portfolio and handed it to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. "This appears to be in order," Judge Merritt said, reviewing the document. "Was this loan documented in the bankruptcy filing, Mr. Parker?" My father's face had gone pale. I didn't think it was a formal loan. Cassandra had come into some money from her military service, and she offered to help with the down payment. It was a family arrangement. A family arrangement documented with a promissory note, payment schedule, and interest terms, the judge observed, looking over her glasses at my father. "Signed by both you and your son Marcus as officers of the company." Marcus stood abruptly. "That was years ago. She never once asked for repayment." "Actually," I said calmly, "I have copies of 17 emails over the past 3 years requesting updates on repayment, all unanswered." I handed over the printed emails, each one showing increasingly direct requests for the loan to be addressed, culminating in a formal demand letter sent 30 days before their bankruptcy filing. The judge reviewed them, her expression growing more severe. "Mr. Parker, these communications appear to establish that Ms. Parker has a valid claim as a creditor. Furthermore, the timing raises questions about whether this bankruptcy filing was made in good faith, given that it closely followed a formal demand for repayment from a family member." My father's shoulders slumped. Marcus was frantically whispering to their attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Your Honor," I said, "I have additional information that may be relevant to these proceedings." I could stop here, walk away with my claim acknowledged but likely never paid. Let them face the consequences of their actions without further intervention. It would be justified after how they'd treated me, but standing there, seeing my once proud family reduced to desperation and deception, I realized this moment wasn't about what they deserved. It was about who I had become despite them, not because of them. I took a deep breath and continued. "I believe there may be a path forward that would satisfy the legitimate creditors while allowing the family business to continue in a modified form." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Continue, Ms. Parker." Behind me, I could feel the collective held breath of my family. They had no idea what was coming next. No concept of what I'd built while they thought I was simply surviving. I opened my portfolio fully, revealing the complete picture of what Sergeant Cassandra Parker, the family disappointment, had quietly accomplished during the years they'd written me off as a failure. "Your Honor, I've prepared a restructuring proposal," I said, withdrawing a bound document from my portfolio and handing it to the clerk. "It outlines a plan to satisfy the creditors at 80 cents on the dollar immediately, with the remaining 20% to be paid over 3 years, with reasonable interest." Judge Merritt took the document, her expression skeptical but curious. "And how exactly do you propose to fund such an arrangement, Ms. Parker? The outstanding debt is substantial." This was the moment I'd rehearsed countless times, driving back and forth to physical therapy appointments for my knee. The revelation that would either rebuild my family or confirm our permanent estrangement. "I have liquid assets sufficient to cover the initial payments," I said evenly. "And I own several income-producing properties that can secure the remaining obligations." I handed over my financial portfolio, bank statements, property deeds, investment accounts, and a detailed personal financial statement prepared by my accountant. The kind of documentation that left no room for dismissal or doubt. As the judge reviewed the materials, I heard a small gasp from my mother. From the corner of my eye, I could see Marcus staring at me, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been shame. Judge Merritt looked up from the papers, her gaze sharp. "Ms. Parker, these documents indicate personal assets of over $3.2 million. Are you willing to risk your own financial stability to salvage your family's situation?" The question hung in the air. Behind me, I could almost feel my family holding their collective breath. The same family that had left my belongings in garbage bags. The same family that had called my military service a waste of potential. "I'm not proposing charity, Your Honor," I replied. This would be a business arrangement with proper legal protections. I've built my portfolio on sound investment principles, and I don't intend to compromise those now, even for family. Something like approval flickered across the judge's face. In that case, she said, the court will need time to review this proposal in detail. We'll recess for 1 hour while I consult with the trustee. As Judge Merritt left the courtroom, the silence broke. The bankruptcy attorney was already leafing through my proposal, his earlier despair replaced by cautious optimism. Various creditors huddled with their lawyers, calculating what 80% immediately might mean compared to years of collection attempts. I turned to find my entire family staring at me. Riley was the first to approach, his expression open, with amazement. "Cass, this is unbelievable," he said quietly. "How did you manage all this?" "One investment at a time," I answered, starting with my deployment pay. I lived simply, invested consistently, and didn't try to maintain appearances. I couldn't afford. My father stepped forward next, his movements hesitant in a way I'd never seen before. The confident stride of Parker Family Properties' founder was gone, replaced by the uncertain gait of a man confronting his failures. "Cassandra," he began, his voice rough. "I don't understand. How did you—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to form the question that mattered. "How did the daughter you dismissed as a failure build a multi-million-dollar portfolio?" I finished for him. I learned some things in the military that apply surprisingly well to civilian life: discipline, planning, risk assessment, patience. My mother approached, still clutching her handkerchief. "Why didn't you tell us?" It was such a perfect encapsulation of our family dynamic that I almost laughed, as if my success was somehow a secret I'd kept from them, rather than a reality they'd refused to see. I tried, Mom. "Remember when I mentioned buying my first duplex? You changed the subject to Vanessa's kitchen renovation. When I talked about my investment strategy, Dad said I should leave finances to people who understand them." She blinked rapidly, perhaps truly seeing me for the first time in years. "I thought you were just making conversation." "That's the problem," I said softly. "You all decided who I was the moment I enlisted and never bothered to update your assessment." Marcus had remained frozen by the plaintiff's table, but now he approached, Vanessa trailing behind him. His expression was complicated, anger and resentment warring with desperate hope. "So you've been sitting on millions while we struggled?" he demanded, though his usual force was diminished. I met his gaze steadily. "I built this portfolio while serving 3 tours in Afghanistan, Marcus, while recovering from a knee injury that still wakes me up when it rains. And yes, while watching you buy vacation properties you couldn't afford and cars that depreciated the moment you drove them off the lot. We invited you to live with us," he countered weakly. "You invited me to Christmas dinner," I corrected, "then locked me out when I went to buy dessert. There's a difference." Vanessa stepped forward, her perfectly maintained exterior showing cracks of genuine emotion. "Why would you help us now, after how we've treated you?" It was the first honest question any of them had asked, one I'd asked myself repeatedly during the 3 months since that snowy night. "Because the military taught me something else," I said after a moment. "Sometimes you fight alongside people who wouldn't choose you, but you still have their backs because it's about the mission, not the personalities." I turned to face all of them. "But let me be clear, this isn't a blank check. It's a restructuring. If you want my help, there will be conditions, oversight, changes to how the business operates." My father's expression darkened slightly. "You want control of the company." "I want accountability," I corrected. "The company needs it. This bankruptcy didn't happen overnight. It came from years of poor decisions and financial denial." Before anyone could respond, the bankruptcy attorney interrupted. "Mr. Parker, I've reviewed Ms. Parker's proposal, and frankly, it's the best option you're likely to get. Most of your creditors would accept immediate partial payment rather than years of uncertain collection attempts. My father looked torn between pride and pragmatism. The Parker patriarch had always prided himself on building something from nothing. Now he was being offered salvation by the daughter he'd dismissed as misguided. What exactly would this oversight look like? He asked finally. I withdrew another document from my portfolio. I'd planned for every contingency, another habit from my military days. I'd take a 51% ownership stake in a reorganized company. Major decisions would require my approval. The family properties would be evaluated, and the underperforming ones sold off. Your personal spending would have strict limits until the remaining creditors are paid in full. Marcus made a choked sound. You expect us to live on an allowance while you control everything? I expect you to live within your means, I replied, evenly. Something most Americans manage to do every day. Riley had been reviewing my proposal over the attorney's shoulder. Cass, this is incredibly generous, he said. You're essentially betting your own financial future on the family business. It's a calculated risk, I corrected, but one with appropriate safeguards. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but for once, they seemed genuine rather than performative. I don't understand why you would do this for us, after everything. I looked at her directly. Because despite it all, you're still my family. And because I learned in Afghanistan that sometimes you have to rebuild from the rubble, not walk away from it. The courtroom doors opened, and Judge Merritt returned earlier than expected. Everyone scrambled back to their places as she took her seat. After reviewing Ms. Parker's proposal with the trustee and consulting with several of the major creditors, the court is inclined to consider this restructuring plan, she announced. However, I want to be absolutely clear about several points. She looked directly at my father and Marcus. First, this arrangement would require full financial disclosure moving forward. Any attempt to hide assets or income would result in immediate referral for criminal charges. My father nodded stiffly. Second, the judge continued, Ms. Parker's position as majority owner must be legally secured with appropriate documentation. This court will not oversee another family dispute disguised as a business matter. Understood, Your Honor, my father replied. Finally, the judge said, her gaze sweeping across my entire family, the court recognizes that Ms. Parker is undertaking significant personal financial risk with this proposal. The records indicate she has built her portfolio through prudent investment and disciplined management, precisely the approach that appears to have been lacking in the family business. Marcus flinched visibly. The judge turned to me. Ms. Parker, are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed with this proposal? The court would understand completely if you chose to limit your involvement to your existing creditor claim. Everyone was watching me. The weight of the moment pressed down like tactical gear in the Afghan heat. I could walk away justified, or I could step into a complicated future bound to a family that had failed to see my worth until they needed what I'd built. I'm certain, Your Honor, I said firmly. Very well, Judge Merritt replied. We'll schedule a follow-up hearing in 2 weeks to finalize the details. In the meantime, I expect all parties to maintain the status quo. No additional debts, no asset transfers, no surprises. As the judge exited, the tension in the courtroom finally broke. Creditors and their attorneys began gathering their things, many glancing my way with new interest. The bankruptcy attorney was already on his phone, likely informing his office of the unexpected development. I collected my portfolio and turned to leave. My family remained clustered at the front of the courtroom, still processing what had just happened. Only Riley broke away, catching up to me near the door. Cass, wait, he called. What you just did in there, it's incredible. I paused, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the hearing was fading, leaving behind the familiar ache in my knee and a newer pain in my chest. It's business, Riley, I said, whether they understand that yet or not. He studied my face. It's more than that, And you know it. You could have let them lose everything. Maybe, I acknowledged. But then I'd be making the same mistake they did. What's that? I glanced back at my family, still huddled together, their world forever changed. Confusing net worth with actual value. The 2 weeks that followed the bankruptcy hearing passed, in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and tense family dinners that felt more like business negotiations than reunions. I'd rented a small office space downtown to handle the restructuring, refusing to work out of the family business headquarters with its mahogany furniture and framed photos that excluded my military years. My new space was minimal but functional: a desk, ergonomic chair, my physical therapist's insistence for my knee, and walls bare except for my framed CPA certification and a shadow box containing my Purple Heart and service medals. The only personal touch was a small potted plant, a resilient species that didn't need much attention to thrive. My squad leader in Afghanistan had called me the same once. I was reviewing the latest property evaluations when my father walked in without knocking. Some habits die hard, especially for men who've spent decades believing their presence required. No announcement. Cassandra, he said, taking in my modest office with barely concealed judgment. You could have used the conference room at headquarters. No need for... He gestured vaguely. This serves my purposes, I replied, not looking up from my spreadsheets. What do you need, Dad? He lowered himself into the chair across from me, wincing slightly. His back had been troubling him for years, though he refused to acknowledge it. Weakness of any kind was unacceptable in the Parker philosophy, except apparently financial weakness, which could be hidden behind leased luxury cars and country club memberships. I've been reviewing your restructuring plan, he said, placing a folder on my desk. I have some concerns. I finally looked up. I'm sure you do. The Providence Heights development is integral to our brand. Selling it off would signal weakness in the market. I pulled up the property file on my laptop. The Providence Heights development is leveraged at 127% of its current market value. It's hemorrhaging money every month on construction loans and architectural revisions. It's not a brand asset, it's a vanity project. My father's jaw tightened. That development was going to be my legacy. There it was, the crux of our family's financial disaster. Legacy, image, the appearance of success rather than sustainable growth. Legacy isn't built on debt, Dad, I said, more gently than I'd intended. It's built on sound decisions that stand the test of time. Like your apartment buildings? He scoffed, hardly the Parker standard. My 4 multi-unit properties were modest but well-maintained buildings in solid neighborhoods, purchased below market value and renovated efficiently. They generated consistent monthly income and had appreciated steadily. Nothing flashy, nothing requiring marble lobbies or concierge service, just good sustainable investments. My apartment buildings are paid for, I replied evenly. Can you say the same about Providence Heights? He didn't respond directly, which was answer enough. The buyers you've lined up for the commercial parcels are offering below market value. They're offering fair market value in today's economy, not the inflated projections you've been working with. And they're offering cash, which we need to satisfy the creditors. My father leaned forward. I built this business from nothing, Cassandra. Before you were born, before any of this. He gestured at the city skyline visible through my window. You're dismantling my life's work over a few temporary setbacks. I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention. Dad, I'm saving what can be saved. The business didn't fail because of temporary setbacks. It failed because of a fundamental disconnect from financial reality. We took calculated risks, he insisted. You took gambles, I corrected, and you used other people's money to place your bets. He flinched as if I'd struck him. Perhaps I had. The truth can be sharper than any physical blow. I never thought it would come to this, he said quietly. Having my daughter dictate terms to me about my own company. I never thought I'd be locked, Out of a family dinner with my belongings in trash bags, I countered. Yet here we are. A heavy silence fell between us. Outside, the sounds of downtown traffic provided a mundane backdrop to our family drama. Horns honking, brakes squealing, the steady pulse of a city that continued regardless of our personal crises. My father seemed suddenly older, the confident real estate mogul replaced by a man confronting the consequences of decades of financial bravado. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that looked like genuine regret. That night, he began hesitantly. When you were asked to leave, I didn't know until after it happened. I raised an eyebrow. And if you had known? He looked away. I don't know. Things were so stressful. The Providence project was falling apart. The banks were calling daily. That's not an answer. What do you want me to say, Cassandra? He asked, his voice rising. That I would have defied your brother in his own home. That I would have taken your side when you've never taken ours? Taken your side? I repeated, incredulous. When have you ever taken mine? When I enlisted? When I was injured? When I came home with PTSD and couldn't sleep through fireworks on the 4th of July? The military was your choice, he said, a familiar refrain. We had a place for you in the business. A place where I'd be what? Marcus's assistant? Mom's protege learning how to plan charity galas while the company cooked its books? He stood abruptly. I didn't come here to rehash old arguments. No. You came to try to preserve the most financially disastrous project in the company portfolio because it feeds your ego, I said, standing to meet his gaze. But that's not how this works anymore. Providence Heights goes on the market next. Weak. My father's face flushed, but before he could respond, my phone rang. I glanced at the display, Riley's number. I need to take this, I said, reaching for the phone. My father gathered his folder. This discussion isn't over. Yes, it is, I replied firmly. The terms were clear. Majority control means majority decisions. Providence Heights is being sold. He left without another word, his footsteps heavier than when he'd arrived. I answered the phone, grateful for the interruption. Riley, what's up? Have you seen the news? He asked without preamble. About Marcus? I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. No, what happened? He's been giving interviews about the secret military millionaire saving the family business. Local business journal picked it up first, but now other outlets are running with it. He's positioning himself as the one who always believed in you while the rest of the family doubted. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course. Marcus could never allow someone else to control the narrative, even when that narrative was my life, my service, my investments. Send me the links, I said, my voice tight. Already did. Check your email, Riley replied. Cass, he's twisting everything, making it sound like he facilitated this restructuring, like he's been your biggest supporter. I opened my laptop and pulled up the email. The headline made my jaw clench. Local veteran secret millions save family empire. Brother says he always knew she would come home a hero? The article was worse, featuring posed photos of Marcus looking solemnly at the camera. Quotes about how he'd always admired his sister's financial discipline and how the family had rallied around her service even when they worried for her safety. Complete fiction. Absolute revisionist history. I've got to go, I told Riley. I'll call you back. I grabbed my coat and keys, anger propelling me out of the office and into my car, a practical 4-year-old Subaru that Marcus had once called my veteran charity case car. The irony wasn't lost on me as I drove toward the family business headquarters where I knew he'd be holding court, rewriting our history for public consumption. The Parker Family Properties building stood on the corner of Main and Elm, a converted, historic bank with columns and excessive ornamentation, much like the family itself. I parked in the visitor section rather than the family spots, a small act of defiance that no one would notice but me. Inside, the receptionist, a new hire, who didn't recognize me, tried to stop me. "Excuse me, do you have an appointment?" I kept walking. Family doesn't need appointments. "Ma'am, I need to," but I was already pushing through the double doors to the main office area. Staff members looked up in surprise as I strode past, my service boots making decisive sounds against the marble flooring. I could hear Marcus's voice coming from the conference room, that smooth, practiced tone he used when impressing clients or, apparently, journalists. Her military experience gave her unique insights into investment strategies that I pushed open the conference room door. Marcus sat at the head of the table, surrounded by 3 journalists and a photographer. Vanessa stood behind him, one perfectly manicured hand resting on his shoulder in a pose that screamed supportive spouse. The room fell silent as I entered. Marcus recovered first, his smile never faltering. "And here she is, the woman of the hour." He stood, arms outstretched as if to embrace me. "We were just talking about your incredible journey." "Were you?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Funny, since you weren't part of it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The journalists exchanged glances, suddenly alert to the promise of a better story than the one they'd been fed. "Cassandra," Marcus said, his smile stiffening. "Why don't we catch up after I finish with these fine people? They're doing a wonderful piece on the family's new direction." "You mean on how you locked me out in the snow 3 months ago, but now want to claim credit for my financial success?" I asked. The journalist nearest me sat up straighter, pen poised. Vanessa's smile had disappeared entirely. "That's a mischaracterization of a complex family matter," Marcus said smoothly. "As I was just explaining, our family has always supported your unique path." I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "Is that what you call it? Because I remember being called damaged goods after my injury. I remember being seated at a separate table at family gatherings. I remember garbage bags full of my belongings." Marcus's face hardened. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Why?" I asked. "You wanted publicity. You wanted to control the story." "Well, here I am, the actual story. Would anyone like to hear it directly from the source?" One of the journalists, a woman with sharp eyes and a recorder already running, nodded. "We would very much like to hear your version, Ms. Parker." Marcus stood abruptly. "This interview is over. My sister is clearly emotional and—" "Your sister," I interrupted, "is now the majority owner of this company and the reason you're not living in your car. So perhaps you should sit down and let me speak." A tense silence blanketed the conference room. Marcus remained standing, his knuckles white where they gripped the back of his chair. The journalists had stopped pretending to take notes and were now openly recording, sensing that the real story had just walked through the door. "Ms. Parker," began the sharp-eyed journalist, "would you care to elaborate on your role in the family business restructuring?" I pulled out a chair and sat, maintaining eye contact with Marcus as I did so. This wasn't how I'd planned to handle the situation, but I'd learned in Afghanistan that sometimes you have to adapt to the terrain you're given, not the one you expected. 3 months ago, I was invited to a family dinner. I began, my voice steady. I brought dessert and groceries as a thank you for the invitation. When I stepped out to pick up some additional items my brother had requested, I returned to find the locks changed and my personal belongings in garbage bags on the porch. It was snowing. The journalist's eyebrows shot up. "And this was because I was told I was a financial burden," I said simply. "That as a veteran living on disability, I couldn't possibly contribute to the family and should figure out how to stand on my own 2 feet. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably behind Marcus, whose fake smile had completely vanished. "That's not exactly—" he began. "Marcus," I cut him off. "There were witnesses. Don't compound the problem by lying now." He fell silent, a muscle twitching in his jaw. I turned back to the journalists. What no one in my family knew was that while serving 3 tours in Afghanistan and recovering from a combat injury, I'd been systematically investing my military pay and building a diversified portfolio worth over $3.2 million. The photographer's camera clicked rapidly, capturing what must have been quite a tableau. Marcus standing rigid with anger, Vanessa's frozen society smile, and me, the combat veteran in practical clothes, calmly dismantling their narrative. So, when the family business faced bankruptcy due to years of mismanagement and excessive personal spending, I chose to step in with a restructuring plan that would save the company while protecting my own investment. The youngest journalist, who hadn't spoken yet, leaned forward. Why would you help the same family that had treated you poorly? It was the same question Vanessa had asked in the courtroom, the same one I'd asked myself countless nights. The answer still wasn't simple. Military service teaches you many things, I said after a moment. One of them is that sometimes the mission matters more than personal feelings. The Parker family business employs 47 people in this community. Those jobs were worth saving regardless of how my family had treated me. That's very noble, the sharp-eyed journalist commented, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. It's not nobility, I corrected. It's pragmatism. And to be completely transparent, my restructuring plan includes strict oversight and majority control. This isn't charity. It's a business decision with proper safeguards. Marcus finally found his voice again. Our sister has always been the pragmatic one, he said, attempting to regain control of the narrative. That's why we knew she'd be the perfect person to help guide us through this temporary financial setback. I almost admired his audacity. Almost. Marcus, I said calmly, 3 days ago you called me a military robot who wouldn't know how to manage real client relationships if they came with an instruction manual. Let's not pretend you've suddenly discovered my business acumen. A flush crept up his neck. The journalists were now openly taking notes, their earlier puff piece clearly forgotten in favor of this far more compelling family drama. Perhaps we should continue this another time, Vanessa suggested, her voice strained. When emotions aren't running quite so high. My emotions are perfectly under control, I replied. They've had to be, given what I've experienced both overseas and since returning home. The photographer captured another series of shots. I wondered briefly what story these images would tell. The decorated veteran versus the bankrupt family that had rejected her until they needed her money. It wasn't the narrative I would have chosen, but then very little about my relationship with my family had gone according to plan. The sharp-eyed journalist turned to Marcus. Mr. Parker, would you care to respond to your sister's characterization of events? Marcus straightened his tie, buying himself a moment. Family dynamics are complicated, he began, falling back on vague platitudes. Cassandra's military service created a distance between us. Perhaps there were misunderstandings on both sides. Misunderstandings, I repeated. You called me damaged goods to my face, Marcus. You told me my combat injury was convenient, because it gave me an excuse not to work a real job. Those aren't misunderstandings. They're deliberate cruelties. The room fell silent again. Even Vanessa looked uncomfortable now. Is that true, Mr. Parker? Asked the younger journalist. Marcus's expression hardened. My sister has chosen to focus on certain negative interactions while ignoring years of family support. What support would that be? I asked. When I was hospitalized for my knee reconstruction, none of you visited. When I completed my CPA certification, while still in physical therapy, you dismissed it as a backup plan. When I mentioned my first property investment, Mom changed the subject to Vanessa's kitchen renovation. My voice remained level, but I could feel the old hurt rising like floodwater against a failing dam. I took a deep breath, centering myself the way my trauma counselor had taught me. The truth is, I continued, my family decided who I was, by Moment I enlisted instead of joining the family business. They created a narrative where I was the failure, the charity case, the disappointment. That narrative was comfortable for them, and they maintained it regardless of evidence to the contrary. The sharp-eyed journalist was nodding slightly. I suspected she'd encountered similar family dynamics in her own life. And now that narrative has changed, she observed. For them, yes, I acknowledged. Suddenly, I'm the financial savior, the secret millionaire, the wise investor. But I haven't changed. I'm the same person who was left in the snow 3 months ago. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. You're painting us as villains when we're your family. Family is more than DNA, I replied quietly. It's how you treat people when they're vulnerable. It's whether you see their value beyond what they can do for you. The conference room door opened, and Riley walked in, looking momentarily startled at the scene before him. He recovered quickly. Sorry I'm late, he said, nodding to the journalists before turning to me. Cass, the bank called. They've approved the loan restructuring for the McLean Avenue properties. Thank you, I said, grateful for both the information and his calm presence. We'll review the terms this afternoon. Riley had stepped into the restructuring as my right hand, his legal background proving invaluable. Unlike Marcus, he'd approached the situation with honesty and a willingness to learn. He'd been the only one to apologize sincerely for how the family had treated me. Mr. Parker, the sharp-eyed journalist addressed Riley. What's your perspective on this family financial situation? Riley glanced at me, then at Marcus, who was silently fuming. My perspective is that our family was fortunate enough to have someone who could help when we needed it most. Whether we deserved that help is another question. It was perfectly diplomatic while still acknowledging the truth. Marcus shot him a betrayed look. Now, if you'll excuse us, Riley continued, we have a business to restructure. Perhaps we could reschedule this interview when we have actual progress to report, rather than speculating about family dynamics. The journalist recognized the polite dismissal and began gathering their things. The photographer took a few final shots. The sharp-eyed journalist handed me her card. When you're ready to tell your full story, she said quietly. I'd be honored to listen, I nodded, pocketing the card. Thank you. As they filed out, Marcus turned on me. Are you satisfied? You've just turned a positive press opportunity into a family expose. I didn't ask to be included in your press opportunity, I replied. In fact, I've explicitly asked to keep my involvement private while we stabilize the business. The secret. Savior narrative plays better, Vanessa interjected. People love an underdog story. I'm not a narrative, I said, my patience wearing thin. I'm a person who served her country, built something substantial through discipline and sacrifice, and is now trying to salvage what's left of a family business while maintaining professional boundaries. Riley placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. He'd learned early on to recognize when my PTSD was threatening to surface. The subtle pressure was his way of saying, I'm here. You're not alone in this. The McLean restructuring is a win, he said, changing the subject deliberately. It frees up significant cash flow that we can redirect to satisfying the creditor's immediate demands. I focused on his words, letting the business details ground me back in the present. Good. We'll need to review the final terms before signing, but that's promising progress. Marcus hadn't moved from his position at the head of the table. So, that's it? You humiliate me in front of journalists and then just switch to business talk? I sighed, suddenly exhausted. What do you want, Marcus? An apology for telling the truth? Or would you prefer I conform to your revised history where you've always been my biggest supporter? I want some damn respect, he snapped. This is still the Parker family business. And it almost wasn't, I reminded him. It almost didn't exist at all because of decisions you made. The only reason we're having this conversation in this building is because of my intervention. Vanessa placed a restraining hand on his arm as he opened his mouth to retort. Marcus, she said quietly. Perhaps now isn't the time. Something in her tone made me look at her more closely. Beneath the perfect makeup and designer outfit, Vanessa looked tired. The strain of the past months had left its mark, albeit one, carefully concealed with expensive cosmetics. "We should go," she continued. "We have that appointment with the financial counselor." Financial counseling was one of my conditions for the restructuring. All family members with business involvement had to complete a personal finance course. Marcus had fought it bitterly until I made it non-negotiable. His shoulders slumped slightly, the fight going out of him. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat lacked conviction. "It never is with family," I replied, more weary than angry. "Now." After they left, Riley pulled up a chair beside me. That wasn't how I'd planned to start the day. I let out a humorless laugh. Not exactly my morning plan either. He studied my face. "Are you okay? Really?" No one else in the family ever asked that question and actually waited for the answer. They asked it as a pleasantry, not as a genuine inquiry. "I'm managing," I said truthfully. "But days like today make me question whether this was the right decision." "Saving the business?" "Saving the family," I clarified. "The business I can fix with spreadsheets and strategic planning. The family, that's a whole different kind of battlefield." Riley was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think you're changing things. Not quickly, and not without resistance. But there's change happening." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that underneath all the anger and resentment and revision, there was still something worth salvaging in the Parker family. "Maybe," I conceded. "But for now, let's focus on what we can measure and verify, like the McLean restructuring." Riley nodded, understanding my need to return to the solid ground of financial analysis where the rules made sense and the outcomes were predictable. Where, unlike family dynamics, discipline and strategy reliably produced results. The follow-up, bankruptcy hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after the initial revelation. I arrived an hour early, partly from military habit, if you're not early, you're late, and partly to gather my thoughts before facing Judge Merritt again. The courthouse was quieter than before, just a few paralegals and attorneys moving purposefully through the marble halls. I found a bench near a window overlooking the park across the street, where dogwood trees were beginning to bloom. 5 springs had passed since my last deployment, yet sometimes it still surprised me to see flowers blooming without the threat of hidden explosives beneath them. I opened my portfolio and reviewed the restructuring documents one final time. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, securing bridge financing, negotiating with creditors, assessing property values, and implementing oversight mechanisms. Through it all, my family had oscillated between grudging cooperation and open resentment, with the exception of Riley, who had thrown himself into the work with genuine commitment. "Thought I'd find you here early." I looked up to see Mr. Hargrove, the bankruptcy trustee, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair, and the perpetually tired expression of someone who'd seen too many financial disasters. He sat beside me, briefcase balanced on his knees. "Force." "Of habit," I replied. He nodded. "Military precision. Wish more of my clients had it." He glanced at my portfolio. "Your proposal has created quite a stir in financial circles, you know. Not every day a family bankruptcy gets resolved with a restructuring this comprehensive. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "Depends on who you ask," he said with a small smile. "The creditors are cautiously optimistic. Your father's friends at the country club are less enthused. Something about the daughter usurping the throne, if the gossip is accurate." I wasn't surprised. My father's circle viewed business the same way medieval nobles viewed bloodlines. Patriarchal succession was the natural order, and anything else was an aberration. "And what do you think, Mr. Hargrove?" I asked. He considered this for a moment. I think it's the cleanest solution to a messy situation, and I think your family doesn't realize how lucky they are." He stood, checking his watch. "Judge Merritt likes precision, too. Might want to head in soon." I gathered my things and followed him toward courtroom C. As we walked, I spotted my father and mother entering the building, both dressed impeccably as always. Image until the end. They saw me but made no move to approach, instead huddling closer together like two people facing a storm. Inside the courtroom, the scene was notably different from 2 weeks ago. Instead of panic and desperation, there was a sense of organized resolution. The bankruptcy attorney looked almost cheerful as he arranged documents on the plaintiff's table. Various creditors and their representatives were engaged in quiet conversation rather than angry muttering. I took my place at the table I'd been assigned as the restructuring sponsor. Minutes later, Marcus and Vanessa arrived, both avoiding my gaze as they joined my parents. Riley slipped in just before the bailiff called the room to order, sliding into the seat beside me. "Sorry," he whispered. "Last-minute call from the McLean property manager. Nothing that can't wait." Judge Merritt entered, and we all rose. As she took her seat and adjusted her glasses, I noticed she was reviewing what appeared to be a news article along with the case files. My stomach tightened, likely the coverage from Marcus's ill-fated press conference. "Parker family bankruptcy proceeding. Follow-up hearing," she announced. "I understand a formal restructuring plan has been filed with the court and provisionally accepted by the major creditors. Is that correct?" The bankruptcy attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We've submitted the complete documentation, including Ms. Parker's financial commitments and the oversight protocols as requested by the court." Judge Merritt nodded, then looked directly at me. "Ms. Parker, the court has reviewed your financial disclosures and finds them in order. However, before proceeding, I must address something that has come to the court's attention." She held up what was indeed a printout of the news article. "It appears there has been some public discussion of these proceedings, including conflicting accounts of the family dynamics at play. While this court doesn't typically concern itself with family disagreements, I am concerned about potential misrepresentations that might affect the restructuring plan's viability." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge continued, her gaze moving between us. "Let me be perfectly clear. This restructuring relies on good faith cooperation from all parties. If the court determines that any party is undermining the process through public misrepresentations or behind-the-scenes maneuvering, we will immediately revert to standard bankruptcy liquidation. Is that understood?" A chorus of, "Yes, Your Honor," echoed through the courtroom. Judge Merritt seemed satisfied and turned her attention to the trustee. "Mr. Hargrove, please summarize the current status of creditor negotiations." The trustee stood and presented a detailed overview of our progress. 83% of creditors had accepted the immediate partial payment terms. The remaining were expected to agree by week's end, and the initial disbursements were prepared for release upon court approval. Throughout his presentation, I kept my expression neutral, though inside I felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in what we'd accomplished in just 2 weeks, lingering anger at how I'd been treated, uncertainty about the path forward, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to address. After the trustee concluded, Judge Merritt turned to my father. "Mr. Parker, as the original head of the family business, do you affirm your commitment to the terms of this restructuring, including the leadership transition to your daughter?" My father stood slowly, his posture still commanding despite everything. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but subdued. "I accept the terms as outlined. And you understand that this includes strict limitations on business expenditures and personal draws from company accounts." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I understand." "Very well." The judge turned to Marcus. "And you, Mr. Marcus Parker, as the most recent operating officer, do you affirm the same?" Marcus rose, straightening his tie in a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, though the words seemed to pain him physically, including the requirement for financial counseling and prior approval for any public statements regarding the company. A flush crept up his neck. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Merritt nodded, then addressed me. "Ms. Parker, you are undertaking significant financial risk and responsibility with this restructuring. The court wants to ensure you are doing so with full awareness of the challenges ahead, particularly given the complex family dynamics at play." It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging the obvious tension in the room. "I'm proceeding with eyes wide open, Your Honor," I assured her. "The restructuring plan includes sufficient safeguards and clear boundaries to protect both the business interests and my personal investment." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Based on the documentation provided and the representations made here today, the court approves the Parker family business restructuring plan as outlined. The bankruptcy proceeding will be held in abeyance pending successful implementation of the plan, with quarterly reviews for the next year." She struck her gavel once, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "This hearing is concluded." As people began gathering their things, a palpable sense of relief filled the courtroom. Creditors shook hands with the bankruptcy attorney. The trustee was already on his phone, likely informing other stakeholders of the outcome. My family remained, seated as if unsure what to do next. Riley squeezed my arm gently. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You just saved the family business." "We saved it," I corrected. "I couldn't have done this without your help." He smiled. "First round of quarterly reviews should be interesting." "That's one word for it," I replied, watching as my father finally stood and approached our table. He stopped a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back in the posture he'd maintained throughout my childhood. Authoritative, slightly distant, perpetually evaluating. "Well," he said, "it's done. The restructuring is approved," I corrected. "The real work is just beginning." He nodded stiffly. "I've had my assistant clear out the executive office. You'll want to move in there immediately to establish authority with the staff." It was so perfectly in character that I almost laughed. Even in defeat, he was issuing directives, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "I'll be maintaining my downtown office," I replied. "The executive suite can be converted to a conference area. We'll need the space for team meetings as we implement the new business model." His eyebrows rose slightly. "You're not taking the executive office?" "I don't need mahogany furniture and a corner view to lead effectively," I said. "What I need is transparency, cooperation, and honest accounting, none of which that office has seen in recent years." The barb landed. My father's expression tightened, but before he could respond, my mother appeared at his side. "Cassandra," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of carefully managed emotion. "We're hosting a small gathering at the house this evening to mark this new chapter. You should come." It wasn't quite an invitation and definitely not an apology, but it was something, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that I was now an essential part of the family's future. "What time?" I asked. 7 o'clock, she replied, seeming slightly surprised that I'd accepted. "Nothing formal, just family." I nodded. "I'll be there." As they walked away, Riley rejoined me. "Dinner at the family fortress. Brave move." "Necessary." "Move," I corrected. "This restructuring only works if we establish new patterns of interaction. Besides, I'll have you there as backup." He looked startled. "Me? I wasn't invited." "You're my second in command in this restructuring, and the only family member who's demonstrated consistent good faith," I replied. "Consider yourself officially invited, unless you have other plans." Riley grinned. "Cancel plans to watch my combat. Veteran sister face down the family that underestimated her? Not a chance." We gathered our materials and headed out of the courtroom. In the hallway, I spotted the sharp-eyed journalist from Marcus's press conference, clearly waiting for anyone involved in the case to emerge. When she saw me, she straightened hopefully. "Not today," I said before she could approach. "When the restructuring is further along, I'll contact you." She looked disappointed but nodded respectfully. "I'll hold you to that, Ms. Parker. Your story deserves to be told accurately." As we walked out into the spring sunshine, I found myself thinking about stories, the ones my family had told about me, the one I was now writing for myself, and the larger narrative of the Parker legacy that was being rewritten with every decision I made. "You know what the hardest part of all this is?" I said to Riley as we crossed the courthouse plaza. "Dealing with Marcus's ego?" he suggested. I smiled slightly. "That's up there. But no, it's reconciling the past with the present." For years, I built my life separate from the family, created my own foundation while they dismissed me. Now suddenly we're interconnected again, but everything has shifted. Riley considered this as we walked. "It's like trying to rebuild a house on old foundations that aren't quite level." "Exactly," I agreed. "And everyone has a different blueprint in mind." We reached my car, and I paused, keys in hand. "Tonight at dinner, watch how they sit, how they speak, who they address directly, and who they talk around. It'll tell you everything about how they're adjusting to the new reality." Riley raised an eyebrow. "Military observation techniques?" "Afghanistan taught me to notice patterns," I said. "Who sits where, who speaks to whom, which elders command respect. Those details kept my unit alive in villages where the politics were as dangerous as the IEDs. "And now you're applying those skills to family dinner," he observed. "That's actually pretty sad when you think about it." I unlocked the car door. "Sad but necessary." "See you at 7? He nodded. "I'll bring wine. Good stuff, not the overpriced. Garbage Marcus always insists is investment quality." As I drove away from the courthouse, I found myself thinking about the difference between value and cost, a distinction my family had never quite grasped. They'd always equated price with worth, appearance with substance. It was that fundamental misunderstanding that had driven their financial decisions and, ultimately, led to bankruptcy. But it had also shaped how they valued people, including me. My quiet investments weren't flashy enough to register. My military service wasn't prestigious enough to celebrate. My financial discipline wasn't impressive until it saved them from complete collapse. Tonight's dinner would be the first test of whether anything had truly changed, whether my family could begin to see beyond appearances and recognize actual value. I wasn't optimistic, but I was prepared. After all, preparation was another lesson Afghanistan had taught me. Sometimes, the most dangerous terrain looks deceptively familiar, and sometimes the greatest threats come from those who are supposed to be on your side. 7 o'clock found me standing outside my parents' colonial-style home in Oak Hill Estates, the neighborhood that had once represented the pinnacle of Parker family success. The house stood tall and imposing with its manicured lawn and stately columns, though I now knew the mortgage was underwater and the property taxes were 3 months in arrears. I'd changed clothes after the courthouse, not to impress anyone but for my own comfort. Dark jeans, a fitted blazer over a simple blouse, and my military-issue watch. No jewelry except my service ring. My hair was pulled back in a practical knot, the same style I'd worn throughout my deployments. I wouldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't, not anymore. Riley pulled up just as I was about to ring the doorbell. He joined me on the porch, a bottle of wine in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. "The wine is for dinner," he explained. "The portfolio is in case Marcus tries something. I brought copies of the restructuring agreement and judicial orders." I smiled despite my nerves. "Always prepared." "Learned from the best," he replied, nodding at me. "Ready?" I pressed the doorbell. "As I'll ever be." My mother answered, wearing an elegant but subdued dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Riley beside me. "Cassandra," she said, recovering quickly. "And Riley. How nice." "I hope it's all right that I invited Riley," I said, though it wasn't really a question. "He's integral to the restructuring." She stepped back to let us in. "Of course. We're just having drinks in the living room." The house smelled of expensive candles and the faint lingering scent of my mother's signature dish, beef Wellington, which she made only for what she considered important occasions. The significance wasn't lost on me. This dinner mattered to her, though I wasn't sure if it was about reconciliation or merely maintaining appearances. The living room fell silent as we entered. My father stood by the fireplace, tumbler of scotch in hand. Marcus and Vanessa occupied the love seat, while two other guests, my father's longtime attorney, Frank Milligan, and his wife Diane, sat in matching armchairs. Frank had represented the family for 20 years, but had mysteriously been absent from the bankruptcy proceedings. I'd always suspected he knew the business was mismanaged, but had chosen to distance himself when things went south. "Cassandra," my father acknowledged with a stiff nod. His gaze shifted to Riley. "And Riley, I wasn't aware you were joining us." "I invited him," I said simply. "Good evening, Frank, Diane. It's been a while." Frank stood, extending his hand. "Cassandra, quite the heroic intervention you've made. The talk of the legal community, I must say." I shook his hand briefly. "Not heroism, just sound financial planning." "And military discipline, I imagine," he continued. "Your father always said you were the most tenacious of his children." My father had never said any such thing within my hearing, but I let it pass. This evening would feature enough confrontations without creating unnecessary ones. My mother appeared with a tray of drinks. "Cassandra, your usual? Soda water with lime?" It was a small but notable moment. She'd remembered my preference. After my second deployment, alcohol had become problematic for me, amplifying the PTSD symptoms rather than dulling them. I'd stopped drinking entirely during recovery. "Yes, thank you," I replied, accepting the glass. Riley declined a drink altogether, which raised eyebrows until he explained he was driving. Vanessa made a comment about rideshare services being so convenient for those situations, clearly implying that abstaining was unnecessary. The subtle dig, suggesting we were being unnecessarily austere, was pure Vanessa. My father cleared his throat. "Well, I suppose a toast is in order. To new beginnings for Parker family properties." Glasses were raised. I noticed Marcus barely lifted his expression tight. "And to Cassandra," Frank added, raising his glass higher. "For stepping in when it mattered most." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though Marcus's expression darkened further. Vanessa placed a restraining hand on his knee. My mother directed us to the dining room, where the table had been set with the formal china and crystal that had been wedding gifts from my grandparents. Another significant choice. These items only appeared for the most important occasions. As predicted, the seating was revealing. My father took his usual place at the head of the table. My mother, instead of sitting at the opposite end, as was her custom, had placed herself to his right. Marcus and Vanessa sat to my father's left, while Frank and Diane were positioned on my mother's side. Riley and I were seated at the far end, physically distanced from the power center. I caught Riley's eye as we sat, and he gave a subtle nod. He'd noticed, too. My mother brought out the first course, a butternut squash soup that had been a Parker family tradition for generations. The recipe had allegedly been passed down from my great-grandmother, though I'd once found the exact recipe in a 1980s cookbook in my mother's collection. As we began eating, my father adopted what I thought of as his board meeting posture, straight-backed, authoritative, prepared to direct the conversation. "Cassandra," he began, "I assume you'll Want a full briefing on current projects and client relationships. Frank has offered to help facilitate the transition. I've already reviewed all active projects, I replied evenly. And I've met with the management team. What I need is access to the off-books arrangements you've made with certain clients. A heavy silence fell over the table. Frank studied his soup with sudden intensity. I don't know what you mean, my father said, though his expression suggested otherwise. I think you do, I countered. The special billing rates for country club members. The deferred payment plans for friends that never actually require payment. The consulting fees paid to shell companies owned by certain city officials. Marcus's spoon clattered against his bowl. Those are relationship management practices, standard in the industry. They're financial irregularities at best, potential legal violations at worst, I corrected. And they're ending immediately. My father's face flushed. Those relationships took decades to build. And they've contributed to the company's downfall, I replied. We can't afford special deals and deferred payments anymore. Nor can we risk the legal exposure of questionable consulting arrangements. Frank cleared his throat. Perhaps this conversation should wait for a more appropriate setting. This is family dinner, my mother added, her voice strained. We agreed no business talk. I raised an eyebrow. Did we? Because father opened with a transition discussion. Riley spoke up for the first time. The restructuring agreement specifically requires full disclosure of all business practices, recorded or unrecorded. It's not optional. Marcus glared at him. Whose side are you on exactly? The side that keeps us all out of deeper financial trouble, Riley replied calmly. And potentially away from regulatory scrutiny. That silenced the table again. My mother busied herself collecting soup bowls, though the hired server she'd engaged for the evening could have done it. It was her way of creating movement when conversations became too uncomfortable. As the main course was served, the beef Wellington as I'd suspected, my father attempted to redirect the conversation. Your military experience clearly served you well in building your investment portfolio, he said, his tone suggesting he was making a significant concession by acknowledging this. Perhaps you could share some insights from that time. It was the most direct interest he'd ever expressed in my service. 3 deployments, a Purple Heart, and a medical discharge. And only now, when my financial intervention had saved the family business, did he find my military experience worth discussing. The military taught me the difference between appearance and reality, I said after a moment. Between showing strength and being strong. My father nodded as if he understood, though I doubted he did. In Afghanistan, I worked with village elders who lived in simple homes, but commanded immense respect and held significant influence. And I met foreign contractors who drove luxury vehicles and wore expensive clothes but couldn't be trusted with basic responsibilities. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. The parallel to our family situation wasn't subtle. The application to business seems obvious, Frank commented. Substance over style. Exactly, I agreed. The Parker business model has been heavy on style, light on substance for too long. Impressive offices, luxury vehicles, lavish client entertainment, all while the foundation was crumbling. Marcus set down his fork with deliberate control. Easy to criticize when you've been absent all these years. I wasn't absent, I corrected. I was serving my country, then building my own financial security while recovering from combat injuries. Meanwhile, you were driving the family business into bankruptcy while living beyond your means. Cassandra, my mother interjected. Must we really? Yes, I said firmly. We must, because pretending problems don't exist is exactly how we ended up here. The server appeared with wine, filling glasses around the table except for mine and Riley's. In the momentary pause, I noticed something I hadn't before, a photograph on the sideboard that hadn't been there during my last visit. It was of me, in uniform, receiving my Purple Heart, a picture I didn't even know my parents possessed. Following my gaze, my mother spoke softly. We've always had it. It just wasn't displayed before. The admission hung in the air, an acknowledgement of past failures wrapped in a small gesture of present reconciliation. Why now? I asked, genuinely curious. My mother looked down at her plate. Because we were wrong, she said, her voice barely audible. About many things. It wasn't a full apology, but from my mother, it was unprecedented. My father was staring at her with an expression of mingled surprise and displeasure, clearly caught off guard by this deviation from the family script. Elizabeth, he said warningly. No, Robert, she replied, looking up with unexpected firmness. It's time for honesty. We've lost too much by pretending. She turned to me. We were wrong to dismiss your military service, wrong to diminish your financial success, wrong to allow Marcus to, she faltered. To lock me out in the snow? I supplied. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. Yes, that was unforgivable. Marcus started to protest, but Vanessa silenced him with a look. For once, she seemed to understand that his defensiveness would only make things worse. I don't need forgiveness, I said carefully. I need acknowledgement and change. Acknowledgement of past mistakes and change moving forward. My father set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. The business is changing. The restructuring ensures that. I'm not just talking about the business, I clarified. I'm talking about how this family operates, the values we prioritize, the way we treat each other. Frank and Diane exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable witnessing such. A raw family moment. But I was beyond caring about appearances. For years, I was measured against a standard I never agreed to, I continued. Success defined by zip codes and car brands and vacation destinations. I was found wanting because I chose service over status, substance over style. Riley nodded quietly beside me. The bankruptcy didn't just expose financial mismanagement, I said. It exposed a value system that was always unsustainable. The room fell silent. Even my father seemed unable to formulate a response. It was Vanessa, surprisingly, who broke the silence. You're right, she said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at her. About the values, I mean. I've been caught up in appearances for so long, I'm not sure I remember what real value looks like anymore. Marcus looked at her in disbelief. Vanessa, what are you saying? I'm saying I'm tired, Marcus, she replied, a tremor in her voice. Tired of keeping up with expectations we can't afford. Tired of measuring success by other people's standards. Your sister built something real while we were building a facade. It was the first time she'd referred to me as Marcus's sister rather than by my name. A small but significant acknowledgement of familial connection. My father cleared his throat. Well, this has certainly become more emotional than anticipated. That's not a bad thing, Dad, Riley interjected. Actually, it might be the most honest conversation this family has had in years. Perhaps, my father conceded reluctantly. But where does it leave us? I considered the question carefully. Where did it leave us? The bankruptcy had forced a financial restructuring, but could there also be a restructuring of our family dynamics, our values, our understanding of one another? It leaves us with a choice, I said finally. We can treat the restructuring as a purely business arrangement, with me as the financial savior, but otherwise maintaining old patterns. Or we can use this as an opportunity to rebuild the family on a more authentic foundation. And what would that look like? My father asked, his tone suggesting skepticism but his expression showing a flicker of genuine curiosity. It would look like honest communication instead of performance, I replied, recognizing each other's actual strengths rather than measuring against arbitrary standards, supporting each other's paths even when they differ from expectations. Sounds very idealistic, Marcus commented, though without his usual derision. Maybe, I acknowledged. but the alternative hasn't worked out so well, has it? No one had a counter-argument for that. The server began clearing the main course dishes, the clink of silverware filling the thoughtful silence. As dessert was served, a simple apple tart rather than my mother's usual elaborate confections, I noticed subtle shifts in the room's energy. My father seemed less rigid, my mother more present. Even Marcus appeared to be in genuine reflection rather than simmering resentment. To answer your question from before, I said, looking at my father, my military experience taught me that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you get back up, how you adapt, how you move forward with clarity and purpose. He nodded slowly. A lesson we could all benefit from right now. The company can recover, I continued. The financial restructuring is sound, but its long-term success depends on whether we can restructure how we work together, how we communicate, how we define value. And if we can't? Marcus asked, the question more vulnerable than challenging. Then I'll fulfill my financial obligations under the restructuring agreement, but I'll maintain professional distance rather than seeking family. Reconciliation, I answered honestly. The stark reality of that possibility settled over the table. For all our differences and past hurts, we were still connected, by blood, by history, by the company that bore our name. My mother reached across the table and did something she hadn't done since before my first deployment. She placed her hand over mine. I don't want that distance, she said quietly. I've had enough of it to last a lifetime. Her eyes held mine, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine regret there, and perhaps the beginnings of understanding. Then we start from here, I said, imperfect, honest, and clear-eyed about the past and the future. As I looked around the table, at my father's cautious contemplation, my mother's emotional openness, Marcus's reluctant recognition, Vanessa's surprising alignment, and Riley's steadfast support, I realized we had taken the first tentative step toward a new kind of family structure. Not erasing the past, but not defined by it either. Not pretending harmony, but working toward authentic connection. Not expecting perfection, but demanding integrity. The bankruptcy hearing had exposed our financial vulnerabilities. This dinner had begun to expose our emotional ones. Both were necessary for true restructuring of the company and the family. As we finished dessert and coffee was served, the conversation shifted to more neutral topics. Community developments, Riley's recent legal cases, the upcoming changes to the business, offices. Not superficial avoidance as in the past, but a collective taking of breath before diving deeper another day. When Riley and I finally departed, my mother embraced me in the foyer, a real embrace, not the air-kiss social performance she usually offered. Thank you, she whispered, not just for saving the business, for not giving up on us completely. The restructuring is still in progress, I reminded her gently. On all fronts. She nodded, understanding my meaning. One day at a time, as they say. As Riley and I walked to our cars, the night air cool and clear around us, he bumped my shoulder lightly with his. So, Major Parker, mission accomplished? I smiled at his use of my former rank. Mission in progress, Lieutenant Riley. But with positive indicators? I looked back at the house, still standing, still impressive from the outside, but now beginning to undergo a more substantive transformation within. Yes, I said. I think so. 3 months later, I stood at the podium in the newly renovated Parker Family Properties conference room, addressing the assembled team. The space that had once been my father's executive office had been transformed into an open, collaborative environment with glass walls and modern technology. The first quarterly review under the restructuring plan showed promising results: reduced overhead, improved cash flow, streamlined operations. More importantly, the workplace culture had begun to shift from appearance-focused to results-oriented. My father sat in the front row, still adjusting to his new role as strategic advisor rather than CEO. but engaged and contributing valuable, institutional knowledge. Marcus had surprised everyone by excelling in his reassigned position as client relationship manager, once freed from financial responsibilities. Riley had taken on legal oversight, bringing both expertise and integrity to our contracts and agreements. As I concluded the presentation and opened the floor for questions, I felt a vibration from my phone. A text message notification from an unknown number. I glanced down discreetly. Saw your family's business turnaround featured in Business Weekly. Impressive restructuring. Some of us from the unit are meeting in Chicago next month. You should join Captain Mendez. I smiled slightly. My former commanding officer had always had impeccable timing. Another connection to rebuild. Another part of my life to integrate rather than compartmentalize. The questions from the team were thoughtful and forward-looking, about sustainable growth, client retention, community engagement. No one mentioned bankruptcy or crisis. We had moved beyond emergency response to recovery and rebuilding. After the meeting, as team members filed out, my father approached. Good presentation, he said, still formal but with genuine approval. Clear and confident. Thank you, I replied. The team has adapted remarkably well to the changes. He nodded. Your leadership style is effective. Different from mine, but effective. Coming from my father, this was high praise indeed. I learned from many leaders, I said, including you, both what to do and what not to do. Rather than taking offense, he chuckled ruefully. Fair enough. The best lessons often come from others' mistakes. And from our own, I added. He glanced around the renovated space, efficient, practical, designed for collaboration rather than impression. Your grandfather would have approved, he said unexpectedly. He built the original business on similar principles before I expanded the vision. Expanded it beyond sustainability, I noted, but without accusation. Yes, he acknowledged. A mistake I won't make again, even in an advisory capacity. It was a small but significant moment, my father acknowledging a fundamental error in his approach without defensiveness. As we walked together toward the elevator, he asked, Will you be at Sunday dinner? Your mother's making that pasta you always liked. Another step in the restructuring. Family dinners had resumed, but with new patterns. More listening, less performance. More authenticity, less pretense. I'll be there, I confirmed. With a prospectus for a new property investment. I'd like your input on. His eyebrows rose. My input? You have 4 decades of experience, I said simply. That has value when not clouded by ego or appearance concerns. He smiled slightly. I'll review it before Sunday. As the elevator doors closed behind him, I returned to my office. Not the executive suite, but a practical space with windows, overlooking the city. On my desk sat a framed photograph from Afghanistan, my unit standing together, dusty and tired but united. Beside it now stood a new photo from last Sunday's family dinner, still somewhat awkward but genuine. The Parkers rebuilding, restructuring, learning to value substance over style. My phone vibrated again. Another text, this one from Riley. Contract for the new development project just came through. Clean terms, solid potential. You were right about this one. I smiled. Some investments take time to show their value. Some structures need to be broken down before they can be rebuilt properly. Some missions look like failures until the very moment they succeed. I texted back. Forward. It to Dad for review too. Tell him his input matters. Then I turned to the window, watching the city move below. From this vantage point, I could see the courthouse where the bankruptcy hearing had forced a reckoning, the Veterans Center where I'd rebuilt my strength after returning home, and the small coffee shop where I'd made my first investment plan, on a yellow legal pad while recovering from knee surgery. Different chapters of my story, now finally integrated into a coherent whole. Just as the Parker family business and the Parker family itself were gradually becoming aligned, authentic, sustainable, built on real value rather than appearance. The bankruptcy hearing hadn't just revealed my financial portfolio. It had revealed the true assets and liabilities in all our lives. And in that revelation, we had found the beginning of a new foundation, one strong enough to build upon, together. Hey there. Thanks for watching this story all the way through. If you found inspiration in how Cassandra stood her ground and rebuilt, not just a business, but her family relationships on her own terms, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. On this channel, I share stories of resilience, hidden strength, and unexpected success that will motivate you to recognize your own value, even when others don't see it yet. I post new videos every week about people who turned underestimation into their greatest advantage. Remember, sometimes the person others dismiss today might be the very one they need tomorrow. Your journey matters, your discipline counts, and your authentic path is worth following. Drop a comment letting me know what resonated most with you about Cassandra's story, and what kind of resilient stories you'd like to hear next. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Until next time, remember that true value isn't in appearances. It's in what you build that lasts.